Good evening, everybody. It is 6 o'clock South African time. I'm Wilhelm from Rensburg. I'm Senior Art Specialist at Strauss & Company in Johannesburg, South Africa. And I'm very pleased to welcome Adina Kamien from the Israel Museum and Professor Kim Berman from the University of Johannesburg. I believe Sebastian Deloitte will join us momentarily. I will introduce the three speakers in turn. But I want to start with the topic under discussion here, William Kentridge, New Trajectories. And certainly we've picked up quite a phenomenal trajectory in our sale with the Kentridge works on offer. The trajectory spans 40 years of his creative output, and it starts with a very early etching, some of his very early prints from the 1980s, the famous domestic scenes. As you can see from this is a composite work using 9 etching plates, but we have individual works from the same series, such as you can see in this particular one. And of course, the domestic series focuses on the South African society at the time. That is quite evident in the title, Waiter, and the class and race divisions that was prevalent at the time. Here's another example. These are small scale etchings. And then we move on to 1994, a lovely charcoal drawing on paper. This was done for a music video by the pop group Mango Groove, and it hails a new political dispensation in South Africa after 1994. And you can identify the megaphone that has become quite a well-known motif in his work, as well as the crowd scenes that is also very evident in most of his work. We then jump to 1998. With a drawing that Kentridge did for his very first opera, The Return of Ulysses. And it's not a well-known opera, but certainly very phenomenally directed and designed. Also, Iris, the white iris, and incidentally, people often ask me, where does the iris come from? Where does it fit into his oeuvre? It actually comes from the Ulysses opera. Ulysses on the return after the Trojan War is lying prostrate on a gurney in a hospital, and the drawings show cross sections through his brain, through his heart, and out of the heart then grows the iris, or morphs the iris. The iris, nothing less than a symbol for his wife Penelope. We have this lovely example, as well as the so-called white iris in a clamp. And this work was done as a fundraiser for the Brooklyn Academy of Music when it was published. On to 2006, and this draws on his thinking that went into the design and production of the Magic Flute Opera of the time. We have Almost Don't Worry, a large-scale liner cut that stems from the 2010 The Nose Opera that he did for the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. These two lithographs from the same series, from the same year, 2010. The typewriter, the Universal Lexicon, but the typewriter as motif started as early as 2003 when he did the video animation work Xeno Writing. And on to the most recent work we have on sale, Refugees from 2017. So we're really looking at a trajectory of 40 years of his creative output. But as the title indicated, we're looking at new trajectories. And so we go on to other places, other trajectories. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to Adina Kamien. She is Senior Curator of the Modern Art at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And she also lectures in modern art and curating at the Bezalel Academy of Art and Design. She's curated numerous exhibitions and authored catalogs and articles on Dada and Surrealism, Duchamp, Man Ray, Miro, among many others. She's curator in charge of the Vera and Arturo Swartz collection of Dada, Surrealism and Their Legacies. And a book, Duchamp, Man Ray and the Conundrum of the Replica, was published by the famous Routledge Publishing House. And then pursuing the use of the ready-made in contemporary art, her exhibition No Place Like Home focused on the transformed domestic object returned to a quasi-home within the museum. Kamien's current exhibition at the Israeli Museum, Bodyscapes, focuses on the relationship between the body and nature and on the use of the body as a structure to organize knowledge from prehistory until today. You will notice that I mentioned the Israel Museum from time to time, and just to point out that Strauss and Company also hosts the so-called Museum Moment series, and that the Israel Museum will form part of one of those series where we look at the museum in its entirety. I'm just showing you some of the publications, Adina's publications, and these are all internal publications from the Israel Museum, and also many others that she did externally. And as you can see, she's quite a prolific person. Adina, I don't know if you want to say one or two things about these publications. Now you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Wilhelm, for your beautiful introduction. And I would say that if you go back one slide, the Israel Museum is very lucky to benefit from the generosity of its friends around the world. And the publications you see, Henry Moore focuses on our collection of Henry Moore, Epstein as well, an exhibition surrounding Miro's Spanish Dancer, a private collection. So these are publications that bridge that generosity, the richness of the collection, and ideas which can be developed from them. And I was lucky enough to focus on the Schwartz collection, a great collection of Dada and Surrealism and their legacies, but maybe I'll get to that afterwards.
Okay. I think the magnus opus is certainly this book by Routledge, Remaking the Ready-Made. For me, I quite like the quote of Dalia Ludovits, who emphasizes the importance of the archive. And I think you mentioned that. The unpublished correspondence, documentary materials and interviews.
Yes, it allows us to hear the voices of artists who are no longer with us. So when you base your research on correspondence between the generous scholar, poet, dealer, Arturo Schwartz, who gave us his collection, and Duchamp and Man Ray, through that correspondence, you begin to hear the voices of the artists and to understand the creative process. And in particular here, the remaking of the ready-made, which I'll relate to a little bit more afterwards.
Okay. Now, I think for me, one of the most phenomenal exhibitions that I've ever come across is this one, No Place Like Home. And, you know, I also like to curate exhibitions, but this is hands down the best I've ever seen, the most innovative, where you chose from the collection of the museum and you basically recreated a whole house, placing these various Dada and Surrealist objects in, among other rooms, the kitchen, the sitting room, the nursery. There's also a garage and the like. I think quite phenomenal. I can't rave enough about this.
Thank you. I think when I speak about our Kentridge collection, I can go a little bit more into depth, but if you want now, I can expand a bit on the idea. If we look through art history, we can go through several prisms. So if we look through the prism of the domestic object, it's a way of our understanding how artists relate to the home, domesticity, displacement, many important subjects. So through the acquisition that I made for the museum of a Yayoi Kusama ironing board, which you can see a little bit of on the cover of the catalog, which was supposed to remind you of an IKEA catalog. And it's very much not an IKEA home because it's completely non-functional. But this acquisition of Yayoi Kusama's ironing board led me to the idea of putting it in the utility room. And then it was a matter of populating this home or filling it with the domestic object, turned artwork from the beginning of the 20th century, from Duchamp and Man Ray, to contemporary art. So in the photograph we see on the right, upper right, we see Orozco's Maman home, which combines a house and pianos, and it's actually an interactive work. And we enter this home and we hear the music within the home's sounds. And people could sit on Dali, a replica of Dali's couch, and watch a projection of a carpet. And Victor Bronner, who was a Romanian Dadaist, created actually a surrealist object. This was a loan from the collection of the Pompidou. And below we have Murakami in the children's room, and Sherry Levine, and Elm Green and Drag Set. So they're relating to the issue of, it's called Scouts. So about childhood and erotic longings. So through this transformation, each of the artists said something about the home. And for me, the visitors to this quasi-home within the museum were the family in this uncanny home.
Yeah. And so your latest one is the bodyscapes, and you know how knowledge is being projected on the body. I think that is also quite a phenomenal one. And this is an installation shot of that particular image. But what I want to do now is to ask you to share your Kentridge holdings in the museum with us, because I believe you have quite a phenomenal collection of his work.
Indeed. So we indeed are very lucky, thanks to our international friends and our South African friends, to have nice holdings of works by William Kentridge in the collection. And the first set is a group of 7 photogravures and dry points, where Kentridge projected photographs of his drawings onto a plate, and then combined photogravure and dry point to create the image. So here it's man and woman from Zeno 2. So it's a series that is projected, and he deals with motifs that recur in his sculptures. For example, these bronze sculptures, which were also part of an exhibition in our museum, and planes and chairs. So here again, the matter perhaps of domesticity and displacement, the issue of war, World War II with the Italian front, and prosthetic legs. So the issue of the body and its wholeness and its fragmentation, and that connects with the idea of collage, which recurs very much in the work of Kentridge. The feeling of being caged and loss of freedom, perhaps, in the caged panther, or again, the man who recurs in the bowlers from Zeno 2. The museum, aside from the set of photogravure, also holds 4 Soho Eckstein films. So this focuses on the figures that I think many of us know, the 2 characters Soho in the Soho Eckstein films, the industrialist Soho Eckstein, owner of a diamond mine, the archetypal prosperous businessman during the apartheid years, and Felix Teitelbaum, who is the victim and the sensitive artist. And Kentridge is really both of these figures, and it reflects a conflict of identity and a complexity of identity. And Johannesburg, where I have yet to go, I've never been, is shown here abandoned, empty roads, railroad tracks. And it's a period of rebirth and also devastation. So in these works, here we see probably Felix looking at the devastated city, and he is a captive of the city. So the issue of a sensual artist, a lover, a dreamer, and these are wonderful works made with his characteristic technique of charcoal drawings photographed and then erased and redrawn, and this ongoing creative process which leads to these wonderful films. Monument from the Eckstein series is a 16mm animated film, and it reminded me and of the of Vladimir Tatlin. So this work relates to the monument to the Third International, and my colleague Talia Amar proposed an exhibition which brings together Kentridge's interest in Russian avant-garde with Russian avant-garde material that we hold, and perhaps this will happen, hopefully. The image also recalls works by Henry Moore, a rapt Madonna, daytime and nighttime, and the whole idea of enigma. Moore also has an image of a crowd looking at a tied-up object. Maybe it reminds us of Man Ray or of Crystal, the idea of enigma. And he draws upon images of tribesmen in Nigeria. So this chain of art history, which interests me as a curator. Here we have the other character of Soho Eckstein. He's very heavy, he's very comfortable in his bed, and the rhinoceros probably comes from the film of UNESCO called Rhinoceros. And as Kentridge criticizes totalitarian regimes, so did UNESCO before him in this film, Rhinoceros. So a tremendous historical and literary awareness, as we know. Sobriety relates to issues of love and disappointment. So Felix Teitelbaum's lover and leaves him, and this is the sadness and the tears which emerge and which seem to drown him later on. A wonderful gift to the Israel Museum, or not a gift, extended loan from the Kovenskis from Cape Town, is medicine chest. And these are words that William Kentridge sent me for our No Place Like Home catalog. He says medicine chest is the second projection installation I've made. In the past, I've done several site-specific installations. So in this case, the found screen is the medicine chest. So it's a kind of objet trouvé or écran trouvé. And Wilhelm, you were interested in the issue of surrealism. So we see surrealism both in the automatic type drawings. They're not automatic, but they're led by the unconscious, and the Dadaist influence of the object. So Kentridge brings together both Dada influences and surrealism and gives them his own form. So I had this work. Oh, you know what? I'll get to it. It's not in this order. I'll go back to the medicine chest soon. We have in the collection a video of 8 projections. I Am Not Me, The Horse Is Not Mine, gifted by Wendy Fisher. And this was his first theatrical experience. And this led to the opera The Nose of Shostakovich, which was mounted at the Metropolitan in 2010. So he bases himself on the Gogol tale of Kovalyov, a civil servant in Tsarist Russia, who wakes up one day without a nose. And it's an exploration of the irrational. That's also what's shared with Dada, the irrational in literature and art. So it's a story about human dignity that's scorned and the absurd. So UNESCO also deals, that's the theater of the absurd. And absurd is the only way of discovering the collapse of logic and rationality. So these are images from the nose, and we could see this language of collage. And collage is a socio-political tool, and I see it also as a psychotherapeutic tool, because you're talking about fragmentation of the image, and there's often fragmentation of language as well, and leaving rules of logic. So the nose, here it was shown at the Metropolitan in 2010, and we see the wonderful staging. He also did Wozzeck at the Metropolitan. And at the Israel Museum, my colleague Suzanne Landau showed Kentridge in 1999 in an exhibition of contemporary art collection works. In 2002, there was another example of his work. And then 2009, video drawings. Then the museum hosted the exhibition initiated by Mark Rosenthal, which was traveled from San Francisco to Vienna, to Paris, to New York, and to Jerusalem as its final destination. So it had these 5 sections, the artist in the studio, and Kentridge said the studio is an enclosed space, not just physically, but also psychically, like an enlarged head. The pacing in the studio is the equivalent of ideas spinning round in one's head. And as an admirer of Duchamp, I think about how Duchamp walked around his studio with the ready-mades, which are not yet called works of art, as tools for playing. The mind plays with these objects. He said that he liked to look at the turning bicycle wheel as if it was flames playing in a fireplace. So I think it's something like that, the pacing for Kentridge. Then there was a section on Soho and Felix. We spoke about it before. And he says, there's part of me in each of them, or they're both in me. A third section was Ubu and the procession. So like the surrealists, Kentridge is interested in Ubu Roi. And he says, from a South African perspective, Ubu is particularly powerful metaphor for the insane policy of apartheid presented by the state as a rational system. And now the installation of the magic flute, and he looks at the damages of colonialism described to itself as bringing enlightenment to the dark continent. So I particularly enjoy Kentridge's multimedia approach. Here, when he goes to the nose of Gogol, he takes that short story and it's possible future histories. So he creates a future for the Russian avant-garde, looking at the different strains of Russian modernism and also the horrible end of the Russian avant-garde. So he's looking at the artistic styles and at the political unrest and wars that were behind. So since you were so kind to show enthusiasm about No Place Like Home, I'll just speak a few more minutes about that exhibition, which was shown in Jerusalem in 2017, then in Lisbon in a different version, combining our collection and loans with the collection of the Berardo Museum. And my dream and hope is to create a version in South Africa, because since it's a conceptual show, you can revisit it together with a colleague in another museum, looking at the objects of another museum in relation to this home. So at the entrance, we had Doris Salcedo's doors, so dealing with the issue of displacement in Colombia, next to Duchamp. So an issue, very different approaches to the domestic object. The walls, which were semi-transparent cloth, aim to the idea of art history as something that goes from generation to generation and emotions that permeate the walls of our homes. So this is the kitchen with Mona Khatoum, Lebanese born, yes, Lebanese-born Palestinian-British artist, and she enlarges a greater and calls it greater divide. So she's playing also like a Dadaist on the name. So it becomes a partition wall, and it also talks about domesticity and perhaps not wanting to become part of traditional female roles of the home. So you could sit around a table and watch Rossler's Semiotics of the Kitchen and eat an Oldenburg sandwich as if, and as I mentioned before, the idea came to me from the Yayoi Kusama ironing board, 1963. We bought it through a dealer from her boyfriend of the time. Not many knew that he existed. I didn't. So an ironing board has grown phallic protrusions, and the steam iron, which we don't see from this angle, threatens to flatten the sea of phalluses. Next to it, Alina Shapochnikov, also an acquisition from the accession funds for the museum. And so you have this art history from Duchamp, we see here through, to and Man Ray, to Warhol, to Shapochnikov, to Kusama, in the toilet, the urinal. I took artistic freedom showing it as a urinal only because Duchamp showed it in many ways in his lifetime, not only on the pedestal, the way Stieglitz photographed it, but on the lintel and in a different place of the lintel. So when Gober do their double sink, or Lakovitz, the lipstick, they're all referring to this historical precedent. And here in the bathroom, Kentridge's medicine chest, which I mentioned before, and he describes as a found screen, and it runs with its charcoal drawings in succession, in an animation succession, next to a honey shower by an Israeli artist, Hadassah Goldvicht, or a Palestinian artist, Hanan Abu Hussein, who deals with the place of women in Arab society. So while each artist is telling a story, here it's brought into the quasi-home. More images from this exhibition, but I don't want to take too much time away from Kentridge. And my colleague Tanya Sirakovic later this year will show Kentridge in the context of an exhibition, Picasso to Kentridge, modern masterpieces on paper from the Israel Museum, which will be shown here and at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. So that's the next step for Kentridge in our collection, and we hope to continue showing the works in interesting contexts.
Okay, thank you for that. That was absolutely fascinating. We're back with a presentation. And one last question for you, perhaps, Adina, if you don't mind. We have this wonderful drawing here, and I'm asking you this because you are the specialist in surrealism. Now, when people view this in our exhibition space, they often say it is quite surreal. So how would you see this? Would you also interpret that as something surrealistic?
It's surrealistic, but it's to the same degree maybe romantic, because the issue of ruins harks back to romanticism. But surrealism, some say, is another coming of romanticism, as opposed to Dada, which is not. But I think when you say surrealist, you're also thinking perhaps of De Chirico and the abandoned cities and piazzas in Italy. So I think this sense of ruin and mystery, and the fact that this kind of looks like the Henry Moore I showed, or the other Kentridge, with this issue of wrapping and tying. This is not crystal, but there's something of mystery here. There's something of an unknown past, an unknown future, something that leaves you kind of hanging.
Hmm. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Okay, now our next guest, and I'm glad he joined us, is Sebastian Deloitte. He studied art history at the Louvre School, and after spending some years in the United States, he was back in France, where he completed the thesis, The Contemporary Art Galleries in New York, 1941 to 1943, Typography and the Art Market. And he also regularly contributes to the journal, the magazine Flash Art. He's a member, he's a member of the Louvre Abu Dhabi conservation team. And in 2015, he joins the Saint Estienne Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art. In 2017, he becomes the director curator of the Lille Métropole Museum of Modern, Contemporary and Outsider Art, overseeing various exhibitions, most notably the one on Alberto Giacometti. And in 2020, in collaboration with Marie-Laure Bernadac at the Kunstmuseum Basel, he organizes the largest exhibition dedicated to South African artist William Kentridge ever presented in France. Quite an achievement. Fascinated since childhood, since adolescence by the work of Paul Klee, which he discovered at the Centre Pompidou. He will curate a retrospective devoted to the artist in 2021. Sebastian, I hope you don't mind. I put the abstract of your thesis on the left there, and just the cover of the latest issue of Flash Art, the magazine to which you contribute quite regularly. But tell us a thing or two about that thesis of yours.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation. Well, you've done an excellent PR, so I've got nothing to add. You've been absolutely fantastic. You should join my team as soon as possible. But we're here to talk about Kentridge. I was fascinated by really the moment when, in some ways, the American history became sort of dominant in understanding how exhibition in commercial gallery participated in creating a new narrative and in a way built history in different ways. We have like some iconic exhibition in mind, and I wanted to venture into that alley because often galleries or the materials of galleries are not used for doing this kind of research. So since the days I had started, there were like a few PhD or a few research on that ground, and it's obviously extremely fertile. Recently, I was in a committee, and I know, for instance, there is a research going on now for the gallery in Italy, Latico, in Rome, that has been a very important gallery and an understanding for the history of performances, the connection between Latico, for example, and even Reiner, Simon Forti, that were part of a crew, and they collaborated for over a decade, and how it sort of shifted the way, you know, the whole, I would say, scene, and especially the Roman scene, Italian scene, shifted with this sort of interest with performances and what does it mean. So I mean, there are a lot of alleys, and I think as a museum and doing this kind of research, we can really share a different history. And this brings me to William Kentridge. And I think what is extremely interesting about looking at things from a different perspective, being in South Africa and obviously being on the same time zone as Europe, as often William Kentridge points it, it's very interesting because often you see things from a different perspective, but we understand also because of his family history, because of I would say, of a load of his own personal history, there is a fascination for the avant-garde that William has always had, and especially the European avant-garde. Could be French, it could be Russian, obviously, as it has been pointed about the nose, Gogol, and many, many other things. Also poetry and also the early German expressionism, but also there is reference to Brassai. There are like many, I mean, what is fascinating about Kentridge is to see how he embraces culture in such a wide scope. And I think this is for me, this is one of the most fascinating contemporary living artists, and is among really the amazing artists that to me belong to some extent to, I would say, Picasso family, a sort of artist that engulfs and embraces it all in some ways. And for me, is major artist. And as you've pointed, and as Adina has also said, there was an exhibition in France in 2011 because it was a traveling show that had been like at some point done in conjunction with Jeu de Paume. But the presentation, and I remember seeing that show, I was obviously fascinated but extremely frustrated at the same time, because for someone who had been exposed to some of Kentridge's work, you had just access to a very limited portion of what he was able to do. What is also fascinating, it was sort of pre-documenta, and I think also 2012 was a sort of very pivotal time for Kentridge, because the refusal of time for me is one of his absolutely crucial major artwork. It's a sort of I would say crossroad where everything sort of meets. Obviously, he had started in Europe in Brussels when he was invited by La Monnaie to do his first opera, and then he sort of developed what we've seen, the films, and then the sort of different thing that he has worked with different opera houses across the globe. But I think, you know, for Documenta in 2012, it really sort of created a new dimension, like creating, I would say, a visual piece that is the refusal of time and the refusal of the hour, that is more a sort of performative spectacle and different way to approach the same topic. And this became a method that Kentridge would develop, for example, when we know the Head and the Load, for instance, that he did for like the 100th anniversary of the First World War. And when he did also Kaboom, that is the sort of visual translation of part of that huge performance that he did on that really large scale. So I think, you know, what we did, because in France, or what we tried to do, because we worked with Kunstmuseum Basel, and we were very privileged to have some iconic early works in that show, such as Sophia Town, for instance. We had the drawings of the play in which it participated to some extent. So we had the very early drawings, which was basically the introduction of the show. And I decided to devote 13 rooms to Kentridge for this show. So it was quite a massive show for a major artist. But the idea was also to try to bridge and connect with this kind of European, I would say, culture. So trying to understand, you talked, Adina talked earlier of Ubu, for instance, but also of Méliès. And it was also very interesting to see that for Kentridge, he discovered Méliès only in the late 90s, for instance. It was not before, you know, one could assume that it was something that was part of his, let's say, common knowledge. But it's super interesting to understand at what point these sort of things come into the discussion. And it's also very interesting to see, for instance, we showed a series of big drawings that linked to, for example, to Méliès. And it's also very interesting to see how Kentridge, and this is something that few people knows, unless you've been privileged to have access to William, but also to his archive and to look at, I would say, this kind of materials, is also his use of photography. Because this is not something that obviously he talks about it, and there are some quotes that are very insightful about it. But it's very interesting to see how, for example, he has photographed himself and then nude, even in his studio, and then he has drawn from it, or how he uses it to do like this kind of collages. So this kind of relationship between what is real and what becomes real in some way. So there are many layers. And obviously we, as with many artists, we can have access only to a portion of this, but this is also our job to start reconstructing these things. So one thing that was very important, and I think that was an element that wasn't stressed, for instance, in Basel, and I did wish to stress it, was to talk about some of the sources that were extremely influential to William Kentridge. And also in terms of methodology, I've just mentioned the documenta, but also understanding, when lived in Paris for 1 year, how important the Jacques Lecoq School was to him. And it's something that we've discussed, you know, and he said that he came at some point because he wanted to try to be an actor, and obviously very soon he understood that it wasn't for him. And while doing other things, he started to draw again, and then, you know, it will lead him to the path eventually it would take. But what is extremely interesting is understanding how free was the Jacques Lecoq School in terms of theater, in terms of acting, in terms of gathering the energy of others, in terms of improvising, in terms of making sounds. I mean, all this sort of the data mechanic, but also this kind of influence of some of the cantor theater, all these things like coming from there. And in his early days of understanding and not understanding, because it would come much later. And I think what was really fascinating was basically understanding all these seeds that were planted very early on. And then when it goes back and it does, you know, it works from South African television, and it starts making on the side with his friend, you know, some films, and the early films. I think it gives, in the very early years when it is in Paris, and then when it goes back to Johannesburg, and this is a pivotal moment. Obviously, Kentridge has not yet become the Kentridge we know, and it's really interesting to watch how, in comparison with other artists, his development has been kind of slow until he has found, really, I would say, what would be sort of label Kentridge in some way. Not only the drawings, but understanding also his common and his use of video, and how mixing drawings with video, and well, obviously I mean, Adina has mentioned the Felix and all these drawings that are absolutely super important in understanding, like tide table, all these important moments in Kentridge, I would say, in the late 90s when he started making these early films. But it's really beautiful also when we were able to share with the public, you know, Suffer at Last, you know, all the very early films that Kentridge did, and weaving the whole fabric of the different materials that would basically made him. So what we try to do for the exhibition, we try to have a few works, such as, for example, the Méliès. We had also a Refusal of Time. We had like important ubu that were connecting to, I would say, some French cultural elements to give a different understanding to our audience. And for me, Refusal of Time was very important, because you have, even if it's not the first parade that Kentridge did in the late 90s, in 99, but with a shadow procession, but still, you have all the different components of the performative aspect, the drawing, the philosopher artist, in the way, you know, it tried to replace the fragments of our, I would say, time capsule, our life, within the big frame of humanity, and telling a different kind of myth, like sharing and telling this kind of mythology that all of us belong to some extent. So it's like recreating, having this kind of big program of recreating these different narratives. So it was really sort of enlightening with different projects that Kentridge did, the sort of threads that were kind of recurrent and yet made him so unique. And so the exhibition was quite, you know, if I had known, I would have shared some images. One thing that I was very happy to do, and I mean, if it's something that does interest any of you, I'd be happy to share it at some point. We did film William Kentridge doing a wall drawing for the museum, and I was very, I really organized things in such a way that we filmed the whole process from like the first line to the completion of a drawing, because as we know with William Kentridge, the idea of disappearing and also of time making his work by, you know, what he has done in Rome, for example, by the Tevere, and having triumphant laments that is now almost unreadable, or it's almost entirely disappeared. We only have the trace of that memory through the drawings or through some images or through some short captions, but the artwork is almost now gone. So we knew that also in the process, because William has done it a few times when he did his big show at Reina Sofia, he also did a drawing to accompany Ubu, and he did drawings also for LAM, for the museum, and I really wanted to document it. But so you have the whole process, and it's super fascinating to see William Kentridge working, because the first he arrived and it was quite stressed that for some personal reason he arrived, and he started drawing one first line like super quickly. Did like the first sketches and said, well, no, I'm stopping now, let's go for dinner. So we went for dinner, and then the next day he came back and he said, I need a ladder, a big ladder, I need this. And within basically 2 hours, the whole drawing was just done, and it was pretty amazing. I mean, I think it's one of his most beautiful drawings. I'm a big fan of William Kentridge. I wouldn't say I'm become a groupie, but I've seen like many of his shows, and it was very beautiful, because it was something between Goya in the way it was like also drawings in terms of representing death in some ways, and the sort of obviously you have some quotes of Jarry, like the way Ubu was drawn, you have all these kind of references, but you have this absolutely incredible command of drawings, and this powerful with just like a few strokes and using to raise and to create these kind of shadows within a second. I mean, there is this kind of energy, as if, you know, when you see Picasso drawings and you have some, for example, I heard that you were about to do a show about Picasso, some master drawings of Picasso and Kentridge.
Yeah, Sebastian, certainly very interesting, and I think you're very fortunate to have that lovely drawing and that capturing that whole experience. But I want to move on and introduce Kim Berman to you. Kim, as you can see there, is a National Research Foundation rated scholar and full professor of visual arts at the University of Johannesburg, and also the executive director of Artist Proof Studio, a community-based printmaking center in Houghton, Johannesburg, which he co-founded with the late Nhlanhla Kaba in 1991. A first degree from the University of Witwatersrand, a master's from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Tufts University in the US, and also her PhD from WITS again in 2009. She lectured and exhibited widely in South Africa and internationally. She is committed to engaging arts for social change through her activism and teaching. Her book, Finding Voice, A Visual Approach to Engaging Change, is published by the University of Michigan. And this is the cover of the book. It is about, you know, through art, challenging historical injustices and envisioning a new paradigm in which to move forward. She, as I mentioned, she founded Artist Proof Studio in 1991, and this is a composite image of some of the students, some of the teachers there. And in 2012, they celebrated in a big way. They turned 21, they came of age in 2012. And it was widely published in the media, as well as a massive exhibition at the Johannesburg Art Gallery. You can see the cover of that exhibition on the right-hand side. What I really like about that exhibition is that they managed to clear the whole of the Johannesburg Art Gallery and fill it with prints from the artist Prof studio. But more interesting is she commissioned various curators to choose works from the vast collection of prints produced by the studio, and they filled those exhibition spaces to capacity. Now, I want Kim really to talk about the collaboration with William Kentridge. And as you can see, I made quite an exhaustive list of every single collaboration starting in 1995, which is ongoing up to today. They are busy with working with William. So Kim, what is it like to work with him? Tell us about your collaboration with him.
Thank you very much, Wilhelm. What is it like to work with William? Well, it's actually incredible. It's very inspirational, and I think it's something we can't take for granted. Over the many years, William is enormously generous and incredibly supportive of Artist Proof Studio, and I think he keeps everybody inspired and very, very motivated, and keeps us reaching for all kinds of heights of excellence. So it's been a remarkable journey up until now. We've just, as you said, we've just celebrated our 30th birthday as a studio, which is quite incredible. And the way we celebrated it is we invited William to publish some prints, which basically supported our move to a new space and building a new studio, and then promoted that work. So in terms of collaboration, we understand our collaboration as co-creation in many ways with William, and I think he's really been remarkable, because Artist Proof Studio is a space that provides printmaking education for, we have over 80 students that study each year, but they're young people who cannot afford to study in tertiary education, but have enormous talent and passion. And so all our students are on bursary, and we have to fundraise for that. And a lot of William's support is around his work that we co-publish with him, supports the educational program of Artist Proof Studio.
Yeah, certainly. I want to just show this slide quickly again, because the next couple of slides will show you the workings of some of these. And when you watch the recording of this discussion on YouTube, please spend some time and just marvel at, I think it's almost 36 projects that you did with them, such as this one, the 8-figure one, the large scale work there.
Yes, 8 figures is a remarkable piece. I mean, it was such a gift to work with William, and I think he started with, you have Almost Don't Worry on your auction as well. He started with 8 figures, and then in close succession did, just with a remarkable amount of energy, because he hadn't done linos, I think, for over 10 or 12 years, and suddenly found such virtuosity in the carving of it. And after those linos, he was busy with the color swatches that he were doing, these interested in color theories, and then we carved with him these remarkable brush paintings as linos that denied their so these linos really look like his brush painting drawings, which has been amazing in terms of working.
And what is also phenomenal about me is for me is the scale, because you know he works on this gigantic. Do you have the pressures to deal with that scale?
Yeah, so I think with his early works from 2000, I mean, he did the Telephone Lady and the Walking Man. We had the biggest press at the time that could print a 2-meter lino cut. So we did, for our 21st that you showed at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, we worked with a number of artists and we did monumental prints, and we asked artists to work on the scale. And that's, I think, how we established some of our kind of specialization on very large monumental scales.
And also sort of another phenomenal work was, of course, the Triumphs and Laments installation that he did in Rome along the Tiber River. And you collaborated with quite a number of prints. I think there he is busy with, what is he doing there?
He's working on Garibaldi, painting actually on the print. But yes, so with that extraordinary Triumphs and Laments, which was a 500 meters frieze in Rome, it was paintings on a wall, and he did original ink wash drawings, and there were 80 of them in the procession. And of course that whole project, the frieze was like an anti-monument because it was destined to fade away, because it was based on the pollution on that wall. But what happened is that William then wanted to take some of these ink washes and make etchings. But what was so interesting is that they were made over 20 to 35 four plates, and then folded up into a book. So again, this kind of monumentality denied the monumentality by becoming folded up, and the idea of the paradox is remarkable. So these very amazing etchings were sugar lift that best translated his wash paintings as permanent etchings in small editions.
I think they're also busy with another image from Triumphs and Laments.
Yes, that was the Bacchus image of the horse, the drunken horse that was both triumphant and an anti-hero. And each plate William would work with etching, and the plates were etched multiple times in acid, and then each plate printed, and we printed on our handmade paper, and we make the paper for William specially out of sisal and cotton fiber, where I have a mill as a research unit in the university, and there they are laying the prints out on the prints on the press, actually collaging it onto cotton cloth that was then folded up into a book. And there the refugees prints is laid out before William then hand colors it, and watercolors ink over the joins of the folds. But again, that is a 36 plates, copper plates or brass plates. Yes, and there he is working on the first proof of the prints, and interestingly he did it, and then when he decides he needs another wash, he might do a splash of ink over the plates, and then that takes weeks and weeks again to etch, only for maybe a minute. So it's a very shallow and a very light etch, but it adds this gorgeous depth of another layer of aquatint, and that's amazing with William. He looks at it and he'll step back, and then he'll say, bring the plates back, and then he'll scratch on them and scrape them off, and this needs to be lighter, this needs to be darker. And so a couple of gestures, and magic happens, complete magic happens.
Yeah, you mentioned the installation at along the Tiber, and there is in front of of a section of that wall. And incidentally, I managed to find the refugee image as well that you can see there. And I think you also used it for a special function. I'm not quite sure where this was.
Yes, this was an exhibition of Artist Proof Studio celebrating at a journey in co-creation, where we had just printed the first proof of this in 2018 at the University of Johannesburg, and we looked at our years of co-creation and collaboration, and so this is the first time we showed this print of the refugees, which is such a contemporary, he calls it You Will Find No Other Seas, which we started in 2017. And I think the original was an ink wash drawing that was called Migrants and Prisoners, and really developed, it's so relevant about migrants. I think it was from a boat of migrants off a coast in 2013 but it became both, something very relevant and contemporary, and then very ancient as well, and historic, and so contemporary to the situation at the moment in the world, that everybody identifies with it. And I think this is a most iconic work. It has 36 plates, and as I say, on handmade paper, and we haven't even finished editioning this beautiful piece. It's a huge piece, and it's
quite remarkable. We mentioned large scale, and I think these are some of the latest prints that he's
well, these are actually not prints. They drawings, but we make the paper for William. He loves the paper that we make in the mill, and each sheet is handmade from sisal cotton, and it holds the ink so well, so it gets a richness. But what we do is we then mount it on canvas so he can fold them up. But this is going to be a big forest of trees at the Royal Academy in London, which she's working on. So these are not
very interesting.
And
I think they is working on the plates.
Yes, and then on the left you actually see the sheets of paper that he's working with his text, and here he's working on the plates. And then we the last triumphs and laments, the she-wolves, that he's signing over there, which is Romulus and Remus, who's again the kind of iconic image of Rome, and that's on the triumphs and laments, both as a skeleton and as a mother, with the milking of the jugs. It's a most magnificent piece as well, and works as a.
I think that's the plate probably of one of the most recent, it's the Sibyl, if I'm not mistaken, in opera.
Yes, a leaf. And again, that leaf William did as a fundraiser for our bursary program. Every leaf from the Sibyl it was from Sibyl, the Fate, where he talks about the people coming to the cave of the Sibyl and picking up a leaf, but the wind blows the leaves up into the air, and you pick up and you don't know what your fate is. And we kind of used that as a metaphor for every print that William made and people bought, provided a bursary for a young artist to study for a year. And so it was a wonderful, wonderful gesture that supported our education program for a year.
Yeah, quite remarkable. And this is sort of one of the, you're celebrating your 30th year here, and that is sort of Roses in a Vase, I think, being
Roses in a Vase and the Lilies are two magnificent prints that William did last year, and again we were thinking of moving studio, and a client of ours invited her friends and called it Flower Power, the power of his flowers, and people bought these works, and we used that again as a fundraiser to build a new studio and to move out of the bus factory into the Isle of Houghton. And these are absolutely gorgeous works again, that on copper etching using a technique of coffee lift. So Artist Proof is trying to translate our whole process into green printing, and a friend of ours came from the US and showed us how you paint with coffee. And actually William last week gave a fantastic talk about his process, and there he is giving his talk last week about coffee lift and how he paints with instant coffee, and then we lift it. These are new works from his lexicon series, based from his sculptural pieces of lexicon. Actually, talking about the talks before that, this is, he calls them medicine cabinet because it has 3 shelves, and then we have the procession, which is a parade, but really beautiful, and you know, working with this very delicate wash of the coffee lift, and then working with dry point as well on the handmade paper. And here he's talking about his process, which has been extraordinary, because his work is, you know, it has such power, not only in the world of people who love his work, but how it kind of translates and supports the cultural industry in South Africa, education and young people, young aspiring artists. He's really so inspirational to that mission. So that, I think, is the story of these works, and the story of our collaboration, which is
absolutely
indeed
fascinating.
a privilege.
Absolutely
Yeah.
fascinating. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And then just by way of ending, just a reminder of the lovely works that we have on the sale, a whole trajectory of our own, 40 years of his printmaking, from the early 1980s etchings right up to the refugee series. Thank you very much, and thank you for our speakers, Adina, Sebastian, Kim. We really appreciate that. If there are any questions, this of course has been recorded, and you can watch it on our YouTube channel soon after. If there are any questions,
Thank
you
you
can
very
use
much.
the chat function perhaps. Otherwise, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and very impressive contributions, and very impressive work that you are doing, all 3 of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.